it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. Part 2. Is this really a good idea? I asked Holloway as we pulled into the car park of Manitoba Construction Limited. I think he's going to realize his daughter's dead whether we tell him or not, Holloway quipped. Well, he knew damn well what I meant, though. I mean, maybe we should just tell him she's been murdered. Not by who. We don't want the Price Crime Syndicate joining our Robert Cassidy manhunt. With their manpower and resources, they'll likely find him first, and when they do, they'll just kill him, I said, as we entered the building. Would that really be the worst thing? The world would be better without him, and believe me, Price would make him feel everything and more that he did to Jessica, Holloway proposed, signing our names at the desk. As the elevator door closed, I added, he needs to face justice. That is justice, Holloway interrupted. That's not justice, that's vengeance, I said, shaking my head. What's the difference? Holloway shrugged. Justice and vengeance are what separate us from the monsters of the world like Cassidy. Vengeance is driven by hate, pain, grief, loss. Justice is driven by passion and the will to give closure to the loss of our loved ones. I looked up at Holloway and stared him dead in the eye. I owe it to his victims to give them justice. I didn't break eye contact until the elevator pinged and the doors opened. Holloway inspected me carefully. Fine, I'll make sure Robert Cassidy's name isn't mentioned. If he finds out we knew, though, and we hid it from him, well, let's just hope we catch him before that happens, Holloway warned. I thanked him for granting my request, and we made our way into the head office. Morgan Price was on the phone, swinging around in his chair, much like a Bond villain would. He was discussing some order and the time it would be delivered, failing to mention what item it was. Well, I could only imagine the illicit content he was actually discussing. As he held up a finger indicating he'd be free shortly, I scanned him up and down. Leader of a multifaceted criminal gang or not, he was an intimidating-looking man regardless. 6'2", well-built for a man of his age. Shaved head and stubble gave him a real villainous look. His dark, menacing eyes were fit for a man who'd done his share of nasty things to get where he is today. I imagined he's very desensitized to violence and torture. I was sure nothing could prepare him for what we had to tell him. Sorry about that, detectives. What can I do for you today? Is that a warrant in your hand? He asked humorously, looking at our case file. Our faces didn't know where to look as he put the phone down. I imagined we weren't the first investigators to visit this place, and we certainly wouldn't be the last. As technically I wasn't RCMP, I let Holloway take the lead. Mr. Price, I'm sorry, but I'm not here tonight regarding anything involving yourself. I'm here about Jessica, he began. Mr. Price's expression went from taunting smile to straight mouth and dead eye. I'm not going to sugarcoat this, Mr. Price. Jessica was found murdered in the early hours of this morning at Little Mountain Park. We aren't treating this as an organized attack at this time. No, we believe it to be an isolated incident by an unidentified subject. I'm so sorry, I really am. Holloway rushed the end of the sentence as if ripping off a band-aid. The next hour or so was exactly what you'd imagine. Words were said, objects were thrown, threats were made. The situation being as intense as it was, I couldn't honestly recall how the entire conversation went, so I won't try, but essentially, after Mr. Price went through all 5 stages of grief within the hour, he wanted to know everything we did. How was she killed? Any suspects? She was raped and murdered, Mr. Price. We don't believe this to be linked to any one of your possible business deals that may have gone wrong, although we aren't ruling out anything at this point. However, a working hypothesis right now is that this was the work of an opportunistic psychopath. But as soon as I'd chipped in, I knew I'd made a mistake. Price looked at me carefully. Not from around here, are you, Inspector? His question caught me off guard. If I gave my real name, it could lead a trail to Cassidy. Ramos. Inspector Ramos. Well, I simply thought of the last person I'd met outside of the investigation. Holloway could sense the tension in the room and dove in to save me. Inspector Ramos here used to work for Dallas PD, but he was recruited for RCMP earlier this year. He's one of the best criminologists I know. He'll find who did this to her and bring about justice, Mr. Price. You have our word. That true, Inspector Ramos? His question was taunting and probing, his eyes still teary. Well, I won't rest until he's caught. Yes, that is true, I said with confidence. And that statement was as true as they come. I just made sure to leave out anything about what I already knew about who he was. Holloway handed over a card to Mr. Price. Please, if you have any questions or feel there's something we should know that could aid our efforts, then please don't hesitate. And Mr. Price, we are sorry for your loss. I'm sure you are, Inspector Holloway and Inspector Ramos. Please, see yourselves out, he said sarcastically. Spinning back in his chair and looking out across his city. Most likely he was thinking which of those insignificant insects out there had the bottle to take his daughter from him, imagining the brutal things that he'd do to them once he found out. Holloway and I didn't speak much on the way down. It was never easy delivering that sort of news, regardless of what they did for a living. When it comes down to it, family is simply everything to some people. Just before we got back to the car, I snapped out of my self-pity. Oh God, I almost forgot to mention. Cassidy, when he murdered those women in the States, there was a pattern to his behavior. When he was in prison, he agreed to take part in a behavior science interview to help us with another case. He confessed that he'd used rental cars when he was out to hunt. After abducting the woman and dumping her, he'd change into some spare clothes. They'd go back to his hideout, motel usually. Here he would shower, wipe down the room, change into some brand new clothes that he'd purchased the day before. He'd dispose of the contaminated clothes via a burn barrel, and then he'd take the rental car to a cash-only car wash. He'd have it valeted, and return it a day later to the renter. He'd then return to Texas in his own vehicle to his wife. I reeled off everything that could have been of use. So, okay, what? We call around every cash wash in Manitoba, ask them to call us when they get a man matching his description requesting a full valet on a rental car. Good idea, James, but the manpower required, it would be... Not Manitoba. Winnipeg. He'll have traveled here, rented the car here. He'll valet it here. It'll fit with all the other murders in the States. He doesn't shit where he eats. He'll hold up outside of Winnipeg, but he comes here to kill, as it's the most populated city in Manitoba. Look, it's 5:40 a.m. now, which means we have... I held my wrist up to my face and checked my watch. Around 4 hours to notify all the car washes. Cassidy always turned up in the mid-afternoon, never first thing or last thing at night. Too significant to potential witnesses. He'll want to blend in to all the other faces. On it, James. Don't want this to sound the wrong way, but you look like shit. Go back to your room, get some sleep, and I'll call you when there's a development, Holloway instructed, making sure not to leave out a friendly grin, thus taking the edge off his comment. He said this as he climbed into his car. I promised him I'd try, and we both drove away. I arrived back at the hotel around 7 a.m. Ramos was just doing the bed changes for my floor. I greeted him warmly, asked him how his day had gone so far, to which he replied, "Steady away, Mr. James. Working a double shift today, though. Need the money." He looked as tired as I did, but the world hadn't broken his spirit yet. I smiled. Couldn't help it. I admired the boy. I decided not to tell him I'd use his name to Canada's answer to Al Capone. As I dug my hand into my pocket, I cursed myself, as once again I'd not gotten a replacement card for the desk. Ramos, though, was quickly on hand to let me in with his master key once again. He said he'd have me another one made up and slide it under my door in the morning. I thanked him and tipped him $10. I would have given more, but it was all I had on me. I entered my room and got to work straight away. I needed to come up with a plan B. I don't know about Holloway, but I couldn't sleep at all, for I was far too busy going through my notes, finding out ways to locate him. The only option, aside from the car wash, was going Providence-wide with an APB to all residents, hoping his landlord or neighbor could turn him in. I had my reservations about that approach, though. Not only could Cassidy charm the spots off a leopard, but he's also a master of disguise, and also, well, public safety. If he even caught a sniff of suspicion from anyone, they'd be dead already before they could even pick up the phone. So essentially, if this failed, we'd need to wait for another body to drop before we had another chance of catching him in Winnipeg. Thankfully, it didn't come to that, because at 2:34 p.m., the RCMP got the call they were waiting for. A white male, mid-40s, athletic build, requesting a full valet on a rental car. The call came from Midtown Car Wash, reporting that the suspect was still there. RCMP advised the worker to take extra time with the car, keep the subject present, and that officers were on the way. I ran out of the room, tripping over my shoes, getting to the car. I pulled out of the parking lot of the hotel and floored it. When I got to the car wash 20 minutes later, Holloway and his team were already there. They'd arrived only moments prior, but I immediately knew by the looks on his face and his body language as he spoke to the car wash clerk that it wasn't good news. He just took off. I did everything you guys asked me to, but something spooked him. He just demanded the keys back, said I was doing a poor job, and jumped in the car and left, the worker explained, as Holloway and I shook our heads, hands on our hips in defeat. The officer who was here first, he took off after him. You might have him by now if you'd arrived at the same time as him. Don't yell at me. It's not my fault you guys have a slow response time, the worker said, hands up in the air as if distancing himself from the failure. Holloway and I looked at each other, puzzled. What officer? Me and my team all arrived at the same time, and Agent Rodriguez arrived shortly after. Sorry, what was this officer's name? Holloway asked. He didn't say. Just said he was with the task force investigating a string of murders. Says his team had called earlier to be on the lookout for a man matching the description he asked for. I just assumed he was with you guys. The worker now began to look concerned. Best show us your CCTV, I piped up, nodding presumptuously towards the office. The worker agreed, and we made our way into the cramped and disorganized office. And that was putting it mildly. How these guys could even keep track of their tax returns was beyond me. The worker sat down at the desk, swiping his forearm across it, pushing a bunch of used fast food wrappers into the nearby trash can before apologizing about the mess in an obligatory manner. Rightio then, so, if I just bring up the time from my call to your office, 2:29 p.m., he said, checking his phone. And there, he exclaimed, pausing the CCTV footage of an image. Pausing the CCTV footage on an image of a man handing over cash to the car wash worker. That him? Holloway asked as he squinted at the image. The figure was wearing a cap and shades, so it would have been impossible to tell if it was Robert Cassidy to the average Joe. Thankfully, I wasn't an average Joe. I'd stared at thousands of crime scene photos, mugshots, and CCTV stills over the past decade to know Robert Cassidy when I saw him. Yep, that's him all right, I said, as I had begun to jot down the vehicle license plate. Hit play for me again, I instructed the worker. The video continued for a few more minutes. Cassidy paid the clerk, and he took a seat across the forecourt. He pulled out a newspaper and began to read it, but, to be honest, it looked more like he was just hiding his face. The clerk, after pulling the car into the valeting bay, made his way into the office. The timestamp coincided with his call to the tip-off line. I noticed while the clerk was in the office, waiting for RCMP officers to arrive, a man entered the car wash. He began approaching a member of staff and conversing with them for a brief moment, before the member of staff pointed to the office where the clerk was. As soon as the man entered the office, this was when Cassidy began demanding the keys from the worker who was working on his car. He left the parking lot in his vehicle shortly after. Just after the car left, the unidentified man and the clerk exited the office and began looking around for him frantically. Shortly after, the unidentified man began to walk out of the parking lot. When he got close to the camera, Holloway slammed his finger down hard on the pause button and stared intensely at the unsub's face for around 5 seconds. "Oh, shit," he said bluntly. "What?" I asked, reluctantly. "That's Marlowe Kane," he informed me. "What the hell's he doing here?" he asked out loud. I stared at him, waiting for him to elaborate. He turned to me looking extremely pissed off, but he rose above his anger to fill me in. In layman's terms, he's Morgan Price's hitman. There's no way Price should know it was Cassidy unless he has someone on his payroll in my department. The hurt caused by this betrayal was evident in the venom behind his words. Not only does he know it was Cassidy, but he knew where he'd be this afternoon. Oh, and let's not forget to mention that we both lied to him, Holloway added. "Shit," we both said in defeated unison. "So, did you see if this officer managed to apprehend the suspect on that thing?" Holloway asked to anyone who could answer. I was too busy making a note of Cassidy's license plate and the direction he'd left in to answer Holloway's question. But the clerk informed him that there's nothing on the CCTV that shows such an altercation. In fact, you couldn't even see the vehicle Marlowe Kane was in, let alone the license plate, or if he managed to catch up to Cassidy. We left a card with the clerk and urged him to contact us directly if either of these men visited the car wash again, and he promised he would. As we exited the car wash, Holloway walked intently towards his car. "Come on, I'm going to go see a friend of mine," he said, purposefully. "Who?" I asked. "If anyone knows something that can help us locate Cassidy, it'll be this guy." Jimmy Burns was a real weasel. To call his apartment a smack den would be described as fairly polite. The yellow stains under his fingernails and gums, as well as the scabs forming around his facial skin, told me Jimmy was a serious drug user. Jimmy was a conniving, methed-out thief who would, and probably had, rob an old lady's purse at knife point, just to get his fix of Class A dope. He was a lot of things, but, well, he had what we needed, information. He was pure scum, but the bastard made it his business to know everything on the street. Holloway and a few other detectives threw Jimmy a few dollars to put towards his next rock, and in return, Jimmy would spill the beans on whoever he needed to. "Jimmy, I was wondering if you'd heard anything about Morgan Price and his daughter being murdered last night," Holloway inquired. Jimmy took a long, hard drag on his cigarette. "Maybe. What's it worth to you?" he asked, frantically scratching at his cheek, knocking the top off one of his many scabs. "Oh, depends on what you know," Holloway countered. "Well, what do you want to know?" "Cut the shit," I jumped in. Time was running out. "Has there been any word about a hit on a man called Robert Cassidy for the murder of Jessica Price?" I asked, pulling out my wallet and showing him $100 Canadian bill. He snatched it from my hand and stuffed it into his shirt pocket. "Sorry, boys, ain't heard nothing about no Cassidy fella. But the word was put out that whoever had information on the bastard did those awful things to that poor girl. Well, they'd be heavily compensated for such information." He finished his sentence with a wink that stuck with me. It wasn't him just being slimy. It was like he couldn't help himself. "Compensated?" Holloway asked. $3 million for the delivery of the man. Alive, of course. You know, so they can torture him and whatnot," Jimmy said, once again pulling hard on his cigarette in a cocky manner. "Well, that explains Kane at the car wash. Someone who knew about the operation tipped off Price, hoping to get the payout when they grabbed him. Goddamn greedy bastards." Holloway stood up and tried his hardest not to kick something. I, meanwhile, studied Jimmy's body language. Something about him told me he just wasn't telling us the whole story. So you have no idea who Robert Cassidy is? I decided to ask. Jimmy scowled at me and took another long pull on his cigarette. Nope. Should I? He answered, a little offended by my question. No, you shouldn't. He's an extremely dangerous man, Mr. Burns. Once known as the cross-line cannibal. He's killed over 30 people in America. Women, men, tall, short, gay, straight, fat, thin, he does not care. The only man to ever break out of Florence prison, melted the face of a federal agent for simply calling him average, and whilst he's been in Canada, he's suspected of killing another 10 people. He's highly intelligent, deceivingly strong, and he's one of the most sadistic sociopaths that I've ever met. I let my words sink in, while Jimmy took another long pull on his cigarette. Good job I've never met him then, he said in a slimy manner after he'd blown the smoke in my face. I tried my hardest not to break his nose. Instead, I pulled out my card and placed it in between a CD case and a crack pipe on his coffee table. If you ever do see Robert Cassidy or hear of his known location, please do not approach him. Don't contact Mr. Price or his associates. You call me, do you understand? I'll make it worth your while as best I can, I demanded. So where is this Mr. Cassidy now? Jimmy asked, just as we opened the door. Last sighting was Midtown Car Wash. An individual linked with the victim's father turned up and went off in pursuit. We've been unable to locate either individual since, Holloway informed him. So if you hear anything, Jimmy, on either person, I'd appreciate the heads up, he added. Jimmy bit his lip in some sort of deranged excitement. His grin showed us all 6 of his yellowing teeth. Sure thing, Holloway. We closed the door behind us and made our way back to our cars. You'll have that 100 turned into a pretty big rock by the time you get back to your hotel, Holloway joked. I have no doubt about that, I chuckled, unlocking the car door. If you hang around for 5 minutes, you'll see him scrambling out of his front door and legging it down to Crystal Heights. His words had a humorous tone, but he was telling the truth. I wasn't local enough to know what Crystal Heights was, but I just assumed it was a block where the meth dealers were plentiful. Listen, I'm going to love you and leave you. Right now I'm heading back to the office. I'm going to find out which of my men is in Morgan Price's pocket, and when I do, I'll paint the walls with him. So I'll call you when there's a development, Holloway added, looking rather psyched up. Cassidy had his first close call today. Without being able to find a previous time where his post-murder process was interrupted, well, who knows what he'll do now. We've potentially missed our window, I claimed, furiously. Hey, come on, James. I know this is all a bit fucked up right now, but we'll get it back on track. Flesh out the mole, rework our profile, and wait for another body to drop. I finished his sentence for him. I sighed heavily. He's killed enough people. Now he knows we're close to catching him. He's going to be like a cornered animal. He'll be more dangerous than ever. Exactly, you just said it. We're close to catching him. He's not thinking clearly, he's lashing out. He'll make a mistake. Now, you're the best of the best, James. You go and do what you do best and figure out what that mistake will be, Holloway ordered, slapping his hand on my shoulder in an act of emotional support. I nodded and thanked him for his faith in me. That night I stayed up, plying myself with extra-strength coffee and Pro Plus. I went through every case file, every post-charge interview, every witness statement, looking for something that would just give me a hint as to where he would be. The only time Cassidy came close to being found out was an incident in Wichita, Kansas, where he was spotted leaving the scene of a murder. Julie Devereaux was the only victim not to be found in a woodland area. She was abducted from Park City and later found dumped in an alleyway, 5 miles from her last known whereabouts. Cassidy was seen leaving the area by a pedestrian, and he questioned him on the blood around his face and on his clothes. Cassidy gave an explanation, blaming a severe nosebleed for the mess. Cassidy reportedly made a hasty retreat from the area on foot. I listened to the tape from Cassidy's interviews after his arrest, and during a behavior science interview, he was asked by Agent Quince why he didn't dump her in a wooded area. Dumping Miss Devereaux's body in a publicly walked street almost got you caught. Why the risk? Did you get bored? No way, Agent. Did you see Miss Devereaux? Did I look like I was bored? I had all kinds of fun. No, I didn't have much choice in that matter, you see. The tank was running on fumes. I couldn't risk driving all the way out to Swanson Bog. If I broke down, then I'd be stuck on the road with a dead girl in the trunk. Not the sort of position you'd want to be in. Okay, so what happened then? I just decided to park up across the street from this alley. Didn't look to be any CCTV or anything. Plan was to throw her in the dumpster, cover her up under some black bags, and hope City Hall would do the job for me. There was nothing like that, though, so I did the best with what I had, and I just dumped her in the corner and covered her up with a tarp and some cardboard. I was heading back to the car when I got spooked by this student. I must have still had that bitch's blood all over me, because he got all nervous. I just gave him some line about my nose opening up and hightailed it. I didn't expect him to buy it, but I just needed to give him something to think about while I split. So, you left the car at the scene? Hell no. With my DNA prints and everything in there. No. I needed the car cleaned and back to the rental place before 5 p.m. the next day. So when the coast was clear, I went back to get it and drove it to a nearby motel. I always used to stay at sketchy places, like where they run drugs or whores. Rooms can be a little, roachy, but less chance of an upstanding citizen reporting a suspicious-looking vehicle to the authorities. Well, anyway, next day I wiped the car down best I could and took it to be valeted. Half expected that night to burn me, but nope. Another 18 months before you boys got lucky. Lucky? Oh, you mean when your wife outsmarted you? What's wrong, Cassidy? Cat got your tongue? Maybe you're just realizing that you aren't as smart as you think you are. Careful, Agent Quince. It's not wise to aggravate me with attempts of attacking my intellectual vanity. I clicked the stop button. That's it. Cassidy could potentially be holding up at a sketchy motel in the Winnipeg area. Somewhere his behavior is much less likely to be questioned. He'll be waiting for the dust to settle, assessing his options. The tape suggested when he's thrown off schedule, he can make rash decisions based on poor assumptions. I pulled out the laptop and speculatively typed in low-star motels on Google, specifically in the Winnipeg area. When I did, a news report caught my eye. Father of 3 shot in parking lot of notorious Crystal Heights Motel after meeting sex worker. Something was happening within me. A small part of me was connecting the dots, but the rest of me hadn't got the memo yet. As my deep subconscious was hard at work battling against the raging hangover, the part of me on caffeine-riddled autopilot continued to read the article about the shooting. A supposedly happily married man had been meeting a sex worker for regular intercourse at the Royal Palisades Motel. Upon leaving one of his secret rendezvous, he was mugged and ultimately shot twice in the stomach after he attempted to wrestle the weapon from the attacker. He's currently in the ICU, but he's expected to make a good recovery. I read the last few paragraphs of the article, which tended to go slightly off topic and speak about the resulting crime rate or some background context to the event. The article wrote, "This is just another in the long and exhausting string of violent offenses to occur at the now condemned Royal Palisades Motel. The motel was once a well-respected establishment, where tourists and even some diplomatic types would use the motel's services due to its handy location in the heart of the city of Winnipeg. However, over the last 3 years, organized crime has poisoned the motel's once great aesthetic. The motel is now a hotspot for both male and female prostitution, as well as the distribution of methamphetamine, earning the location the now unfortunate pseudonym of Crystal Heights. Then, as if by magic, as if by fate, just as the pieces were slotting into their respective places, my cell phone rang. Sorry if I woke you, James, but I have an update. Now, I don't know whether this is good news or not. I shared my concerns about the leak with the super, and he asked everyone who'd knowledge of the car wash operation to surrender their devices. Not one shred of evidence any of them leaked information to Price or his OCG. I mean, obviously I'm glad I don't have a rat in my unit, but, well, I really don't know where to go from here. I have no idea how Price found out. James, you there? Well, I do, I said bluntly. I'll meet you at the Royal Palisades Motel. The Royal Palisades Motel lived up to its reputation. The 2-story L-shaped building had approximately 14 rooms, with a check-in desk location on the corner of the L. As I pulled into the car park, I spotted 3 separate males being led into rooms by half-naked women. A group of 4 young thugs were lingering at the edge of the car park. As I pulled into the car park, one of the thugs approached my window. I lowered the glass a few inches. The thug flicked his chin up in a type of street greeting. "Yo, pussy or a bump?" he asked. I flashed my RCMP badge and he quickly turned around and retreated to his friends. Holloway arrived at the motel around 10:27 p.m., pretty much at the same time, just slightly after. I jumped out of my car and began loading up my concealed carry. Holloway jumped out of his car, walked over to me and stood staring wide-eyed at my focused preparation of the weapon and waited for an explanation. When he didn't get one, he pressed the issue. "Jesus, James, you want to explain to me what we're doing here? And why are you going all silent hitman on me?" "Jimmy Burns." "Yeah, probably here. But he's already told us what he knows, and I don't think a gun will change that." "Not here for information. I'm here to try and save his life." What? What are you talking about?" "He's the leak, Holloway," I snapped as I sprinted towards the office. "And if Cassidy's alive, then Jimmy Burns is in real shit." We burst into the motel office and flashed our badges at the desk clerk. "I need to know if there've been any reservations made at this hotel in the last week by this man," I said, holding up a picture of Robert Cassidy. The clerk squinted. "He may have worn a disguise." I then held up pictures of Cassidy in other people's attire, such as the CCTV from the bank and the car wash. This seemed to strike a tone with the clerk. "Yeah, that man there, the one from that car wash. He checked in earlier this week, a few nights ago. He paid in cash, and to be honest, he looked at the floor the whole time. I thought that was kind of shady, but then again, that's our clientele," the clerk quipped. "Okay, great. What room is he in?" I asked, eyes darting from desk to the window, making sure I couldn't see him myself. "Oh, checked out about 2 hours ago. But if that..." the clerk informed. I cursed and kicked the counter. Holloway interjected whilst I had my mini-episode. "What about Jimmy Burns? He been here tonight?" He didn't need a photo. Everyone at Crystal Heights knew who Jimmy was. "Yeah, checked in the night before your mystery man. He's still here, room number 6. Next door to your man, actually. He was in room 7. "I'm gonna need to get into both those rooms," Holloway said, badge on show. "Now," he added, loudly, when the clerk wasn't quite going as quick as he wanted. When we got to room 6, the desk clerk began to insert the master key into the lock. The thing that struck me, as he and Holloway concentrated on the door, was the window. The entire pane of glass was dripping wet in condensation. As soon as the door opened, steam came pouring out of the room and into the chilly Canadian air. Guns drawn, we made our way into room 6, our pores opening for the sheer density of the steam that filled the room. We realized it was coming from the bathroom, From what we could hear, there was water running. There was a stench in the air. Not something I'd ever smelt before, but it was very distinct. It reminded me of a seafood restaurant. I wasn't sure why, but when Holloway pushed the bathroom door open with his foot, as we held our guns out in front of us, quickly I found out what that smell was, and why it reminded me of seafood. Lobsters. There in the bathtub was Jimmy Burns. His eyes were bulging out of his skull nearly. He was naked with what looked like 2 badly broken legs. His hands were restrained around his back, and he was literally, and I don't have any other word for this, cooking in the bath. The water was on, overflowing onto the bathroom floor. There was a kettle on the toilet seat. The hot tap was turned to its max. The water and the air was piping hot. Jimmy's skin looked redder than a stoplight. It had scaled and blistered to a point that made us all nearly vomit. His lips were crusted and inflamed. I didn't even know if he was able to scream. The worst part was, he was alive. He wasn't responding, but he was alive. We called in EMTs and ERT, and even the paramedics were puzzled on how to approach the situation. They tried their utmost to get him out of the water unscathed, but it was damn near impossible. They gave him morphine for the pain in his legs and skin, but as soon as they grabbed a hold of his body, his skin just came away in their grip. The water turned a crimson red as Jimmy was hoisted out onto a gurney, and he was wheeled into the back of an ambulance. At least 70% of his skin was left in the tub. The EMTs rushed him to Winnipeg General, but he died on the way there. We were told by the medical examiners that his tongue had been bitten out before he was boiled alive. The desk clerk, as well as both me and Holloway, was horrified. I got the impression he and Jimmy were on good terms. He was kind enough to make us both a stiff drink. We all needed one. I noticed a number of cameras around the motel, but in all honesty, I expected the clerk to inform us the CCTV was just for show, given the nature of what goes on here. However, the clerk, when we were all alone, said that the official line when cops came calling is that it's a deterrent, but criminal interests who run their product through here wanted there to be some sort of footage recorded should a rival gang make a move on their patch. And so the motel had installed a private hard drive that recorded the motel for just 1 week at a time. The clerk said he could be beaten up, or most likely a lot worse, for just showing us this, but he said he'd liked Jimmy. Everyone did. He was a lot of things, but he wasn't a bad person in the grand scheme of things. He didn't deserve that anyway. The clerk wanted to help us in any way he could. He took us into the basement, where the hard drive was hidden, and we sat at the monitor, the 3 of us with our drinks, and we began to rewind the footage. We reviewed the footage from the last few days, and we saw Jimmy arrive and check in with a known sex worker 3 nights ago. They went into room 6, and a number of hours later, she left. Jimmy stayed. This repeated later that day, with the sex worker leaving the next morning. And that night, Cassidy arrived in the rental car. He goes and checks in, and he's entering his room. Jimmy comes back from scoring some more meth. He converses with Cassidy for around 10 minutes. After they finish, they give each other a friendly goodbye, and they both go inside. Later that night, Cassidy leaves in the rental car. This was the night that Jessica Price was raped and murdered. Jimmy stays around the motel, scoring meth, entering and exiting his room with various females. Around 10 a.m. the next morning, a man turns up at the motel. He looks completely out of place in relation to the rest of the people there. He's well dressed. He turns up in a blacked-out SUV, and he doesn't look like he's fiending for Class A's. He goes up and speaks to a few people who appear to be regulars at the motel. At one point, he turns towards the camera, and suddenly everything falls into place. It's Marlowe Kane. He walks right up to Jimmy Burns, tells him something, and hands him a card. The man then gets in his SUV and drives away. Well, without audio, it's damn near impossible to be certain this is how it went, but I'm pretty confident. Cassidy arrived at the motel, knowing he was less likely to be reported for acting suspicious than he would at a more respectable establishment. And here he met Jimmy Burns, who would have likely had suspicions about Cassidy himself. Cassidy, not a drug user, nor was he there with any women, and most importantly, he turned up in a rental car. Now, tourists do not stay at Crystal Heights. However, his suspicions were not confirmed until Morgan Price learned of his daughter's rape and murder. Cassidy's MO was always to rob his victims after the murder. He'd use the cash to fund his activities, such as paying for the room or car valet. I believe Price, having learned his daughter's possessions were taken, assumed the attacker was a tweaker, a sex-addicted meth head brutalizing his baby girl, and all for the contents of her purse. Jessica Price was, ironically, training to be a lawyer, promised a retainer representing her father's criminal associates, no doubt. She would have likely had plenty of cash on her person. Her father would automatically assume that someone would take the cash straight to Crystal Heights for an evening of bump and grind. Given that the motel was run by a rival organization, it would be the best bet for someone who committed a crime against Morgan Price to spend the proceeds at a rival's patch. He sent Marlo Kane to the motel to scope it out, spreading the word that anyone with information on the perp would be heavily compensated. Knowing Jimmy Burns knew everything about everyone in that neighborhood, he would have been one of the people Marlo intended to speak to. Cassidy arrived back at the motel later that day at around 12 p.m. You can see him on camera being approached by Jimmy Burns almost immediately. Jimmy seems to be asking questions about the rental car. Again, with no audio, it's hard to tell what was actually said, but Cassidy seemingly offers an explanation. The two converse a little more before Jimmy nods and starts to point out towards the road. He seems to be giving directions. We worked it out that he was pointing in the direction of the car wash. Cassidy enters his room, lightly washing off the violence from last night. Around 2 p.m., Cassidy leaves his room in fresh clothes, gets in the rental car and leaves the premises, heading towards the car wash. Almost immediately as he leaves the parking lot, Jimmy Burns pulls out the card in his cell and dialed a number. Shortly after, Jimmy leaves his room and gets into a cab. This is likely when he went home to meet us. Later this evening, Marlo Kane's SUV pulls back up into the parking lot again, and he makes a beeline for room 7. He finagled the door lock with some sort of device and let himself in. Shortly after, Kane leaves the room and starts to peer through Jimmy's window. When he doesn't see him, he takes out his cell and makes a call, presumably to Jimmy. But then he turns and faces toward the camera. We all gasped. It wasn't Kane, it was Cassidy, in Kane's car and wearing his clothes. Our mouths were as wide as our eyes. I dropped my whiskey all over the floor in shock. Holloway shook his head in disbelief. He honestly looked horrified. Kane was apparently the baddest of the bad, and we really don't think he handed over his ride and threads willingly. Holloway then jumped up and made a call to Detective Walsh and Detective Michaels, requesting them to be on the lookout for Marlo Kane's SUV. We were able to give them the license plate now, with it being on this tape. We reviewed the tape some more, and, as expected, Jimmy Burns arrived back at the motel around 6 p.m. When he does, Cassidy is waiting in the SUV. The SUV flashes its lights, and Jimmy immediately walks up to the Range Rover with that same deranged excitement and climbs into the passenger side. A few tense moments pass before Cassidy emerges from the driver's side. He makes his way around to the other side, takes a quick look around to make sure no one's looking, opens the door and drags an unconscious Jimmy the short distance from the vehicle to room number 6. He doesn't come out for another 2 hours. When he does, he gets back into the vehicle and drives away. 2.5 hours later, me and Holloway drive into the parking lot. We thanked the clerk, who eventually told us his name was Andy. We thanked Andy for his cooperation and showing us this footage. He told us we were welcome, but in return he begged us not to sequester the footage for evidence. Holloway assured him he didn't have to worry about that and that we wouldn't drop him in it with the CCTV's owner. We shook hands and he urged us to get the bastard who murdered Jimmy Burns and Jessica Price. I promised him we'd do our best and we left. I couldn't help but feel bad for Andy as Holloway just lied to his face. See, if we caught Cassidy, that CCTV is evidence that he killed 2 people. It would most certainly be sequestered, although that was a mighty big if. We walked out into the parking lot and reconvened at our vehicles. Holloway inhaled a sharp hit of cold, brisk midnight air into his lungs through his nose and sighed it out heavily through his mouth. God, it seems like for every step forward, we get knocked 2 back, I complained, pinching the bridge of my nose with my thumb and index finger. Well, I've suffered from migraines all my life, nothing new there, but there's a special type of migraine that hits me once in a while, a real humdinger that nulls my senses and makes me want to tear my eyes from their sockets. I've only ever had 4 of them in my life. The first was the night the swarm kidnapped, tortured and killed a federal witness, a surveillance operative and an innocent 10-year-old girl. The second was the night Bill Johnson died of cancer. The third was the night Robert Cassidy escaped from Florence prison. And this was the 4th. Hey, come on. Let's not fall apart here, James. Now, let's look at the bright side. We know the vehicle he's driving. We know he's on the move. At least now we know that Marlo Kane isn't on the trail too, he said with a wink and a slight giggle. I couldn't help but smile at his twisted sense of humor. Holloway was definitely an optimist. I could tell why he was so well liked by the people he worked with. My department has the plate. We set up multiple checkpoints leaving the city. He's trapped, man. We just need to wait for the call and then we can move in, so I think you should go back to my room and get some rest, I interrupted with a sarcastic grin. Yeah, but when I mean rest, I mean like actual sleep, like a normal person, he suggested in a bantering manner. I scoffed through my smile. I can't remember what normal feels like, but I'll try, I promise, I assured him. Well, I got some things I need to put in place to make sure Cassidy doesn't get too far. So if there's any developments, I will call you, he said in a high school girlfriend mocking tone. I couldn't help laugh. First time in years. Well, we were opening our car doors and climbing in when I had an epiphany. I whistled and got Holloway's attention. He looked over at me, raising his eyebrows, signaling that he was all ears. Hey, I don't meet many people in our line of work that I truly respect. I think I've only met 2 in my 24 years as a federal agent. But now I know 3, I confessed, genuinely. Holloway smiled. It meant a lot to him to know that. He began to ask what on earth brought this on, so I interrupted him. The agent, the one who Cassidy killed. I told you he was my best agent and a long-term colleague. Well, what I didn't tell you was that he was also my best friend. We came up through Quantico together, but went our separate ways for a number of years. Eventually, we both joined the Cassidy Task Force in Behavioral Sciences. We brought him down together, including a few others. He's the best agent the Bureau could want, and he was the best partner I could need. I sighed heavily. I just wish I'd told him that before he... I looked at the floor, desperately trying to suppress the flashbacks of that night at the safe house. I'm sure he knew, James, he answered. But I'll call you when I know something. I smiled. Just before I got into the car, I realized this confessional had been entirely one-sided. That made me feel vulnerable. Hey, Holloway, I chirped. His eyebrows and ears perked up. You once hinted you know what it felt like to be scapegoated, like I was with Quintero. I left the sentence open-ended. Rather than outright asking him, well, he began to speak before he caught himself. He bit his lip hard and sighed. "Maybe another time, James, another time," he suggested. I pointed at him and told him I would hold him to that. He agreed, and we both got into our vehicles. He drove back to RCMP HQ to take on a few things. Meanwhile, after a detour to the liquor store, I drove back to my motel. I intended to keep my promise and get some sleep. After what I'd seen tonight, however, I needed something to counteract the adrenaline. So, night 2 is over, and I hope you're into this story as much as I am, because I just cannot wait to finish this tomorrow evening, and I hope you're all going to join me for the ride. Quite a story, isn't it? What's going to happen? So delightfully set up for the final evening. Well, I can't wait, and I really hope you feel the same way. So, till tomorrow evening, when I'll see you all again, very sweet dreams and bye-bye.